Okay, I can get audio this way. You're going to be quiet.
Is that through your computer?
Yeah. I mean, you're going to be quiet. You're going to be quieter than me. Okay, so sorry about that. I'm not sure why the microphone on the camera is not working this time. But you should be able to hear me now, which means that we should start over with our introduction. So, it's good to be with you. It's been a while, but we're back, and we're continuing with our conversation about the family tree of our church. And we want to remind you that if you have any questions about what we're talking about today, or just anything you've wanted to ask us, feel free to put that in the comments, and we will do our best to answer. So today we are in a new venue, and I think this might be where we try to record from in general from now on. This is the new church library. The library team has moved the library across the hall, and they've worked on the they curated the collection. And so you'll notice it's organized really well, and it's a really cool space. There's a couch over here. It'll be great for small groups and things like that. So we're really excited about that. Thank you to the team that did that. Today we are doing the last leg of our family tree, and Pastor Jack, in our last episode, he walked us through Christianity in America and the unique challenge of having this place where there is no established church. And so you've got all these different church traditions that are having to compete without government sanction. Mm-hmm. Because if you were in England, there wasn't really a competition, because the Anglican Church was the official church. The government was on the side of the Anglican Church, so they were in charge. And if you were in Finland, it would be the Lutherans. And if you were in Spain, it was the Catholics. But in America, everybody has to compete. And during that time, there was these pastors, they tended to be Presbyterians, who got tired of the competition and got tired of the divisiveness and of saying that those people can't worship with us because they believe differently on these different things, or their attendance, their membership is placed on the wrong roles, or they have the wrong nationality, and they got tired of all of that. And among those leaders, the most famous are a father and son duo named Thomas Campbell and Alexander Campbell. They were Scottish Presbyterians. And the funny thing there is that Thomas Campbell came to America, and his son, Alexander Campbell, was going to join him later when he was done studying to be a pastor. And while Thomas Campbell was in America, he started going down this journey of really questioning the orthodoxy, the really strict rules of the Presbyterian Church. And he was worried when Alexander Campbell finally joined him there that they were going to be on a different page, and they were going to really disagree. It turns out that Alexander Campbell was going through the exact same journey at the same time on the other side of the Atlantic, so that when they met, they were on the same page. There's another guy named Barton W. Stone, who was also Presbyterian, and he started a movement along the same lines. And one of the really cool things about the history of our tradition is that it actually began with several different groups uniting to form one group, instead of groups breaking off of others. Yeah. And there's a whole story about the journeys that these different groups went on, because at one point the Campbells, they thought they joined a Baptist tradition, and because they had a lot in common with the Baptists, and eventually they realized that they weren't on the same page on everything, and so they split off. There were some interesting things happening with Barton W. Stone and his group, and eventually they joined together to form this one tradition. One of the defining traits of this tradition is they didn't want to take any name that wasn't in the Bible. They didn't want to use names to divide themselves. They were tired of being Presbyterians and Baptists and Anglicans and all those things. They just wanted to be the church of the New Testament. And so they started using names that they found in the Bible, mainly disciples of Christ and Christians. And they called their churches Christian churches or churches of Christ. And so there was a variety of names that they used, and I think the Campbell's side of the movement tended to use the term disciples, and Barton W. Stone's movement tended to use the name Christian, and then when they merged, churches started using both of them together. And this movement really started in the Appalachian area, in Kentucky and Virginia and that area. But, and it started in around the 1820s, and into the 1840s it was really gaining steam. And there was something else important going on in the Appalachian area in the 1830s and 40s, which is the big draw towards the Oregon Trail. So the Oregon Trail, it set off from Missouri, and it drew a lot of people from the state. If you look at the states that tended to send the most people west on the Oregon Trail, they also tended to be the states that had big populations of the Christian church movement. And so what ends up happening is you end up with a whole bunch of people from the Christian church movement joining or going on the Oregon Trail and ending up in Oregon. And so when Oregon was founded, when the territory was founded, you had a huge presence of Christian churches and people in this movement. And to the point, I believe they were the biggest and really a dominant tradition in the area. And one of the, I didn't plan this, but it works out really well. There's a whole book that we have here in our library on this part of our story. It's called Christians on the Oregon Trail. And it talks about our church tradition's involvement in the Oregon Trail. So I've seen a map of people, the Christian church movement in America, and you can really see the history there because there's this huge swath across the east and the south of America of Christian churches and disciples and churches of Christ, and then there's a splotch over in Oregon. It's like all these people in the east, and then nothing really, and then bam, Oregon. And that's because of the Oregon Trail. And so our heritage as a church and the Christian churches in Oregon is very much grounded in the Oregon Trail. And when they came over, they founded all kinds of churches, and there were some very old, by our standards, very old churches Christian churches in Oregon. Yeah. And the Christians in Oregon started gathering together in a convention, a yearly convention, very early, before the Civil War in the 1850s. And they had this convention it was a traveling convention, it was a different place each year where Christian people, members of the Christian church would get together and worship together and spend a week to 10 days in fellowship. Well, eventually in the 1870s, there was a prominent pioneer family named the Turners, and they donated land from their property for the building of a permanent place for the Oregon Christian Convention. And that was the first real presence of our movement in Turner, was this Christian convention. And that is the Tabernacle, the big white building that is just to the west of us. And I've had people who were coming to meet me here at the church, they'd never been here before, and they were waiting for me at the Tabernacle. But that is the Oregon Christian Convention, and they have been meeting there since the 1870s. The big Tabernacle, the big white building, was built in the 1890s, and it is a big, beautiful, gorgeous building. I love it. Yep. And it was actually built, this is what I've been told, it was built using techniques where they didn't use nails. You can actually see the way there's notches for the boards to fit together. And it was this really unique form of construction. When they renovated it in the 1990s, they had to bring in Amish carpenters because they were the only ones who knew how to work with that kind of construction. That's
cool.
That's what I've heard. So that was the first presence of the Christian church in Turner, starting in the 1870s. The first Christian church in the area was over in Almsville. And then in the early 1900s, there was a pastor from Court Street Christian Church that came over and started a church in the town of Turner. And that happened in 1919, which was, interestingly enough, right after the Spanish flu epidemic, or as it was wrapping up. or winding down, I should say. And so they came in and they had a meeting here in Turner, and they founded a church in 1919. I think it was actually the second attempt to found a church in the Turner area. But this one stuck. They had an evangelistic meeting, and they started the church with something like 16 people. And eventually they built a building, and that building no longer stands, but it was in the middle of town. And that's where Turner Christian Church was. There's one more piece to the puzzle, though, of the Christian churches and their presence in this town. Because, so one of the founding members of Turner Christian Church was Cornelia Davis. She was the heiress of the Turner family. So she was Cornelia Turner Davis. And she donated the land on which Turner Christian Church was built. She also donated a significant amount of land so that there could be a retirement community here for retired ministers and missionaries. And that actually started as a ministry of Turner Christian Church. The Turner Christian Church, we were the responsible for the board of directors. And so that started as a ministry of Turner Christian Church, and that ministry grew and has become Turner Retirement Homes. Now, at a certain point, I don't remember exactly when, they became their own distinct ministry that is not overseen, is not officially affiliated with Turner Christian Church as it is. Now, we cooperate, but we are not officially connected by our boards. But that was a ministry that was all connected with the Turner Christian, or the presence of the Christian church movement here in Turner. So you have the Oregon Christian Convention, which started in the late 1800s. You have Turner Christian Church, which was started in 1919, and then Turner Retirement Homes began in the 1930s. And now those are three distinct ministries that happen here in Turner. And so our church just celebrated our 100th anniversary last year, our centennial, and that was great. And it's been interesting to notice that it was founded in a pandemic. We started our first century in a pandemic, and we're starting our second century in a pandemic as well. Yeah. But we're very excited as we look towards the future and look at what the next 100 years is going to be like for this church. Because there's a strong heritage of Christians in this area and in this state. And it's interesting, Oregon has a reputation for being, the Northwest has a reputation for being kind of a godless area. And it's true that we have a lot of work to do in the Northwest, but there's also a very long history of, a very long heritage of strong Christians and big works that God has been doing in this area. That we have to be proud of and that we have to build on.
Yeah, I think it's just an amazing heritage, and I grew up in a church that's over 100 years old. Mm-hmm. I don't remember how old specifically. I think it's in the 110-year range now. In Marcola Christian Church, and then coming to a church that's 100 years old, it's just so cool, and experiencing that history and that heritage, and seeing the interwovenness of all of this heritage at OCC is always a really cool thing. And hearing from churches that have been, they're over 100 years old, and then churches that are new and are growing, that's always a really exciting thing come convention season. Yeah. Week of convention season, that's just really fun. And, you feel as though you're a part of history when you come on and even are just a member or a congregant at one of these churches, and you get to hear the history of what's been going on and for years, and I just think that's really cool. And yeah. I love this area of Oregon, and a big part of me going to BBC was I want to come back to this area and minister, because I know there's a lot of history here, but I also know there's a lot of work to be done here. And I love this area, and so I just think that history is so cool, and being a part of that is just amazing. And
and it's one of the Oregon Christian Convention is really unique in the Christian church tradition. As far as I know, it's the biggest and the longest running state convention. I assumed it was a pretty common thing in the Christian churches, but it's not, because we were kind of this isolated pocket. We were a colony off in Oregon, and in the East, there's a much bigger network. You know, you can connect with churches from a whole bunch of different states, and it's just this bigger movement. But out here, we spent so much time as this, you know, this state over on the other coast, and they all got together. And so the Oregon Christian Convention is very unique, and it's a very cool connection that we all have.
Yeah, and another big one is the North American Christian Convention. That's in like the Midwest, I know of. And that's like become the big one. Like that's where a lot of people from around the world congregate to. But as far as I know, and I could be completely wrong on this, so if I am, correct me. But as far as I know, the Oregon Christian Convention has been meeting longer than that convention.
Yeah.
So though that one is bigger, this Oregon Christian Convention, it's been meeting, I mean, for far longer than a lot of other Christian conventions, and any that I can actually think of, and only took a break, I think, for 1 year for World War II, if I am not mistaken.
I didn't know about that. So if they have, then
I think that might be the only year that they actually took a break, which would make sense.
And World War II was longer than 1 year, so that means only 1 year of World War II did they take a break.
Yeah.
I mean, because this is the 168th that we just had. I'm not going to embarrass myself by trying to work backward in my head, but it's the 1850s, I'm pretty sure is when it started. So that's a really cool thing. Feel free to throw up any questions if you have them. There's one more thing that I do want to talk about before we wrap up this look at our family tree. Because we've talked a lot about the importance of unity in this movement and how much we value the idea of bringing all of God's church together into one movement. Unfortunately, we have not always been successful in that goal. And so in order to help you understand what we're talking about and know your way around this movement that we're a part of, we need to talk about the fact that there have been some divisions in our tradition. And they're actually, while the church, this tradition began with multiple groups coming together, it has actually resulted in 4 major groups coming out of that. The first major division happened after the Civil War. And there are a couple different explanations for why this happened. The thing is, it is not a denomination, it's hard to describe exactly when the two sides split. But most people say they were split by the turn of the century into the 1900s, because that's when they officially were marked as different on the census. That makes it official, I guess. So one of the big things that was over, interestingly enough, was using instruments in worship. Mm-hmm. So the argument on one side was the New Testament does not mention instruments in worship, therefore we should not use instruments. On the other side were people saying, hey, the New Testament doesn't tell us not to use instruments, so let's use instruments. Now, that seems like a silly thing to fight about, but one of the things that's important, that's underlying all of that, is the fact that this was just after the Civil War, and the Christian church movement, to its credit, was the only tradition, the only major group that did not split before the Civil War. Before the Civil War, the Presbyterians split into Northern Presbyterians and Southern Presbyterians, Northern Baptists and Southern Baptists. That's where we get the Southern Baptist convention or denomination, because the Baptists didn't reunite again after like the others did. But what happened was you had all these churches in the same tradition, but the northern churches were affected by the war very differently than the southern churches. The southern churches were devastated. The northern churches were actually pretty prosperous. And so they started using their money to buy things like pianos, which were pretty expensive, pianos and organs. And that caused a lot of resentment that there were all these poor, devastated churches in the South that couldn't afford these things. And rather than helping them, the northern churches were just moving on with their lives and being prosperous. And so there was a lot of tension there, which drove part of that theology. And so eventually what ended up happening is the tradition split. One group broke off, and we call that group the Churches of Christ, because as far as I know, all of the churches in that tradition call themselves Churches of Christ. They're also called non-instrumental Church of Christ because they don't use instruments. And they are unified by this idea that Christians are called to do exactly what the New Testament says, and that we should not do more than what the New Testament says. So they would say, when the New Testament is silent, we should be silent. We shouldn't do the things that the New Testament doesn't tell us to do. And actually, the churches of Christ are the biggest part of this movement, numbers-wise. So they split off in the late 1800s. Then, at the same time, another group developed because of the time period that we're talking about. There were a lot of African Americans who joined the Church of Christ movement at the same time, but we're talking about the South in the late 1800s, early 1900s. They may have had the same ideals, but they weren't allowed to worship in the same congregations. And so you end up with what's called the Black Churches of Christ, which is a distinct group simply because they weren't allowed to worship with white congregations. Then, as you move into the middle of the 19th century, the middle of the 20th century, so the 1900s, you start to see this division among the rest of the Christian churches. And this is the same kind of division that you saw in all the other traditions at the same time. It's called the Modernist Controversy, which is basically the division between liberal and conservative Christianity. So people started to get new theories about where the Bible came from, and how to interpret the Bible, and new theories about ethics and different things like this, and you started to have this split between conservative Christians and liberal Christians. Now, most church traditions had gone through that split in the 1920s. The Christian churches really started to experience that in the 1940s through the 1960s. And the big thing that finally drove them apart was this movement to turn the Christian churches into an official structured denomination. So the idea was, we want to unite with other churches, but other churches have structures. They have denominations, and if we're going to merge with them, we need our own structure. And so what happened was they created this plan to turn the National Convention at the time, which was, I forget what it was called, but it wasn't, I think it was the Triennial Convention. They wanted to turn it into a denomination. And a bunch of churches opted out. And that new denomination became the Disciples of Christ. And the Disciples of Christ are the liberal end of this movement. And so they tend to be called, in my experience, which is very limited, I'm new to the movement, they tend to be called First Christian Church of Salem, for instance. First Christian Church of Salem is Disciples of Christ. First Christian Church of Lebanon, I know their pastor pretty well. And they are on the more liberal end of the scale, and so they're gonna have a lot in common with other liberal traditions, and they have an actual structure and a single denomination. So what we're a part of is basically what's left in the middle, which is we don't have a denominational structure, but we seek to create unity by saying that we follow what the New Testament says, but in the places where it's not explicit, there's freedom and there's ability to for us to find our own way and to disagree on things and still worship together. So what that means is, if you see churches that call themselves Disciples of Christ, they're from this movement, they're from the more liberal end. If you find, and I mean that in a technical sense, not in a way of attacking people, because I know liberal and conservative we use as slurs, but technically, theologically liberal, Disciples of Christ. Then you've got Churches of Christ, which are very theologically conservative. Although, while all the churches in the Churches of Christ are called Church of Christ, not every church that called themselves Church of Christ went with that group. So another way you'll see the central group described is Christian churches / Churches of Christ, because there are some Churches of Christ that are in that middle group. The thing is, when you try not to use names to define yourselves, defining your movement becomes really complicated, and that's why you get all these, like, the names for all these groups and for this movement is just really complicated.
Yeah, I was just thinking about the same thing, and I know some churches that are, Church of Christ, whatever street they're on or whatever, but they're not, they're not non-instrumental or anything like that, and so it's kind of like they're more in the middle, and definitely, had some fun events with them when I was in high school and traveled to different events with them and things like that. And it's just kind of like, that really confused me when I first, heard of the movement and then Churches of Christ. I was like, oh, I know a Church of Christ, but they're not like that in a sense, But then I know people that are from non-instrumental churches and things like that have worshipped with churches I've been in. It's just this interesting dynamic of so many different, like you said, names and theologies and things, and but I think it's really cool and fun to be a part of. So,
and one of the downsides to those kinds of splits is often they can be really bitter. It's interesting how when you have a split, people would rather you were completely different than you picked the other side of this. So they'd rather you were a Hindu than be Christian church when they're Church of Christ.
Yeah.
There can be some real bitterness. But one of the cool things that I've discovered about the churches in Oregon is that split tended to be a lot less bitter and angry here. It still ended up happening because people had to choose sides, but they had to decide, are we going to be part of the new denomination? Are we going to have pianos? But there wasn't the same bitterness. So there's a lot of families that have people in multiple branches. We do have disciples and Church of Christ people who are part of the convention. And so it's cool that the division wasn't as bitter over here. And so there's a lot more cooperation and a lot more understanding. I know a family where there's a pastor in the Christian churches and his brother-in-law is a pastor in the Disciples of Christ. Like I said, I have a good friend I have a friend who's a Disciples of Christ. So my wife's classmate from college back in Illinois, but he's out here now, and it's just cool to see that there are more connections between the different branches, because it's a little sad that this unity movement has been split, but we're still working on it.
I think it's kind of humbling that still happens, despite the original intentions that still happened, and it is humbling in a lot of different ways. So
yeah, humbling is a good word, because there's the tendency for us to say, hey, we figured out it out, we have arrived, the church is fixed now, and it turns out that we're flawed too. So we're not perfect.
Well,
we're just doing our best.
One thing you brought up earlier that I hadn't really thought about, Thomas and Alexander being apart, like split apart by an entire ocean, and still coming to the same conclusions. I think a lot of the times we like to think of this movement as very American, but I think that kind of makes it to where it's like it's not really. It's just in general an idea, of what happened. I thought that was. I hadn't really thought about that before specifically. So
yeah, because both of the Campbells were immigrants. Thomas just came here sooner. Yeah, I didn't think about that. That's interesting. All right. Well, that is the broadcast for today. And so if you have any questions, feel free to throw them up. But I know we threw a lot at you today. And we will be picking this up again next week. I actually haven't planned what the next one's going to be about, but we're going to move into something other than the family tree. And we hope you have enjoyed these videos so far. And we're going to continue doing them. We're just about to start talking about what the videos will look like in the fall, whether we're going to go back to deleted scenes or do something different. But we'll have something that we're going to continue to do each week. And we hope that you'll join us for worship on Sunday morning, 9:30, and Monday afternoon at 3 for deleted scenes.
Yep.
You want to sign us off?
Sure. Stay healthy, stay hopeful, go in peace to love and serve the Lord.
Amen.